You know that feeling when your phone rings and your stomach drops before you even see who's calling? That's how I felt when I saw my son David's name flash across my screen. Sighs heavily. "Mother," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed, like he was reading from a script he'd practiced in front of a mirror. "It's not personal. It's just that you have a way of dampening the atmosphere." I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, even though I already knew where this was heading. In the background, I could hear her, his wife, Margaret. Her voice cut through like glass. She always creates this awkward energy. Then nothing. Just silence. The kind that fills your chest and makes it hard to breathe. All I could hear was the humming of my old refrigerator in the corner. David cleared his throat. "We simply thought it would be better to keep things intimate this year. You understand, just the immediate family." I didn't bother asking who that included. I already knew it didn't include me. "I understand," I whispered, though I didn't. "Not really," voice breaking slightly. I was still staring at the receipt for the plum tart I'd pre-ordered, tucked carefully under a vase. Flowers were scheduled to arrive on December 31st, a burgundy and white arrangement, David's favorite colors, the ones he'd loved since he was 7 years old. "All right then," he said, and I could hear the relief flooding his voice, like he'd just closed a difficult business deal. "We'll connect next week. Happy New Year, Mother." I sat there for a moment after the line went dead, just holding the phone. Then I walked slowly to my laptop and opened the florist's website. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I typed, "Cancel order." The confirmation came back immediately, cheerful, efficient, impersonal. I didn't cry. Not out loud, anyway, but I stayed in that chair for what felt like hours, listening to the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each second louder than the last. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. Because what happened next? Well, nobody saw it coming. Long pause. On New Year's Eve, I didn't light the candle I usually placed in the window. I didn't turn on the television to watch the countdown. I ate my vegetable soup in complete silence, the house so still it made my ears ring with the emptiness of it all. Midnight came. Midnight went. And then, at exactly 1 minute past midnight, my phone erupted with that familiar ringtone. I stared at the screen for several seconds, watching David's name pulse with each ring. "Mother." His voice was frantic, panicked in a way I'd never heard before. "Mother, what in God's name is all over the news? People are calling me, texting me, what's happening?" Slightly amused, I stood up slowly, walked to the window, and pulled back the heavy curtain. The street was empty, covered in fresh snow that sparkled under the streetlights. But I could already feel it, something massive shifting in the universe around me. It had begun. What do you think happened? Drop your guess in the comments before we continue. 6 months earlier, I'd been standing outside conference room B at the hospital, where I'd worked for 23 years. My badge was in my hand, ready to scan for the annual technology review, a meeting I'd attended every single year, presenting updates, reviewing imaging trends, suggesting improvements that nobody else seemed to notice. It was routine. It was mine. It was the one place where my voice actually mattered. But that morning, when I held my badge up to the scanner, nothing happened. The light stayed red. Linda, my supervisor, stepped out into the hallway, her eyes darting everywhere except at my face. "Eleanor," she said, my name sounding apologetic on her lips. "I'm so sorry, but the review is quite selective this year. It's primarily leadership. And, well, you're planning to retire soon anyway, aren't you?" I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded as if it made perfect sense, even though the truth was I hadn't filled out any retirement paperwork. I hadn't even looked at the forms. Voice thick with emotion, I walked back to the break room, sat at the far end of the table, the seat nobody wanted, and opened my notebook like I still had somewhere important to be. That night, alone in my small house, I reread the draft proposal I'd been working on for months. It was straightforward, built on something I'd observed during thousands of scans, tiny, almost invisible shifts in lung imaging that could predict critical changes days before any symptoms appeared. A small project, maybe, but it had real potential to save lives. The next morning, I called an old friend from my residency days, someone who now worked in bioinformatics. I asked for a contact in software modeling. By the end of that week, I'd transferred my severance payment into a fresh business account. Ventnor Diagnostics, LLC. Small. Quiet. Just like me. I told no one in my family. Not David. Not my daughter Sophie. Especially not David. Bitter laugh. He'd already made his opinion crystal clear at Thanksgiving dinner, when I'd mentioned I was working on something new. He'd grinned with that half-mocking expression he'd perfected over the years. "I mean, Mother," he said between bites of Margaret's truffle mashed potatoes, "you genuinely think you're going to be the next tech billionaire with hospital scans?" Sophie had snorted into her wine glass. Someone changed the subject, quickly, sensing the tension. I'd smiled through it all. I washed all the dishes by myself afterward, and that night I stayed awake until 2 a.m, filling the margins of my old journal with notes, circling the patterns I'd always seen, but nobody had ever bothered to ask about. By the end of that week, I'd scheduled my first meeting. That meeting changed everything. What I discovered in that quiet cafe would eventually turn my world completely upside down. Part 2 coming next. The cafe sat halfway between the hospital and the lake, a forgotten little spot I'd chosen specifically because it was quiet. No music, no crowds, just the gentle sound of cups being rinsed and steam hissing from the espresso machine. It was the kind of place people overlooked unless they were searching for somewhere to think. Sarah Mitchell arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. Her coat was still damp with melting snow, but her eyes lit up the moment she saw the tablet I'd placed on the table. "These are the actual results," she asked, pulling her chair close without any small talk. I nodded and slid the screen toward her. For 20 minutes, she didn't speak. She just scrolled, zoomed, tilted the screen, her expression growing more intense with each passing second. Then she leaned back and exhaled slowly through her teeth. Emotional intensity building. "Eleanor, this could revolutionize everything." Everything. Her voice carried weight. She wasn't speaking as a former patient I'd helped years ago. She was speaking as someone who now worked with Venture Harvest, a fund that rarely looked at solo founders over 40, let alone over 60. "It's early stages," I said cautiously, trying to manage my own excitement. "Still in testing phase. But I've mapped it across 6 years of comparative scans." Her hands were already reaching for her phone. "I need you to meet someone." Quietly. Pause. The next meeting was with a man named Marcus who wore expensive cufflinks and never smiled once. He listened carefully. He nodded at the right moments. He asked 2 devastatingly sharp questions that made me think he might reject everything. Then he slid a single-page confidentiality agreement across the table. I read every single word. Twice. By January, we had a timeline. By February, an offer not to buy me out, but to expand. Data security infrastructure. Clinical testing in rural hospitals across 3 states. I didn't post about it on social media. I didn't mention it at the next birthday dinner when Sophie asked what I'd been doing lately. Just reading, I'd said simply. They didn't press for details. They rarely did, voice getting stronger. They'd spent years shaping me into background furniture, present, polite, invisible. But sitting in that cafe with Sarah, watching her eyes light up with possibilities, I realized something profound. I didn't need noise to matter. I didn't need permission, applause, or even a seat at their table. Have you ever worked on something in secret because you knew no one would believe in you? Tell me in the comments. By March, I had a prototype with a proper name and a quiet fund transfer. And by late spring, a message I absolutely did not expect lit up my phone screen. The message arrived at 6:14 in the morning on December 23rd. I was rinsing my teacup when the screen illuminated the dim kitchen. Urgent. Confirm Eleanor Ventnor's identity for transfer authorization. At first, I assumed it was spam. Then I remembered Pulsken AI, the acquisition, the meetings. I hadn't attended the final signing. Sarah had managed those details while I'd been stirring soup on the stove, signing digital documents between dinner preparations. I tapped the link with trembling fingers, entered my verification code. And there it was, the final figure, $142 million. Long, shaky exhale. I didn't gasp. I didn't scream. I simply closed the browser and finished making my tea. My hands somehow steady despite everything. Sarah had told me the public announcement would happen after Christmas. Quiet, professional, a brief mention in the Tech Digest, some investor blogs. Nothing flashy, just enough to meet legal disclosure requirements. I didn't call David. I didn't message Sophie. I knew they wouldn't read the journals that would report it. My name wouldn't trend on any platform they used. That suited me perfectly. On December 28th, the announcement went live. It was a small headline, buried halfway down the homepage of a biotech news site. Pulsken AI acquires predictive imaging tool for over $1 billion to expand rural diagnostic access. Beneath the article was one short paragraph. The tool, developed by Eleanor Ventnor, a retired radiology technician from Vermont, uses data-driven pattern recognition to flag early-stage organ distress in under-resourced medical environments. That was it. No photograph, no quote. But the footer said everything. Founder, E. Ventnor. I reread that line 3 times, my finger tracing the letters on the screen. Voice soft with wonder. Later that evening, I sat by the window as snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes. I watched the street lamps flicker against the cold darkness. No phone calls came. No one in my family said a single word. I suppose I'd been erased so thoroughly from their lives that they no longer checked for signs of my existence. But I knew it wouldn't last. I knew eventually someone would notice, not because they cared about me, but because it would touch something they thought belonged to them by association. I set my phone on the table and turned it face down. New Year's was approaching. And this time I didn't need an invitation to feel like I mattered. New Year's Eve arrived, and with it, the call that would change everything forever. Part 3 is where things get really intense. New Year's Eve settled over my house like a heavy blanket someone forgot to warm. I lit a single candle on the kitchen table, the same one I'd bought in a set of 3, 2 of which I'd given to Sophie last Christmas. I never asked if she'd ever used them. I already knew the answer. The soup was simple tonight: carrots, butternut squash, leftover lentils. I stirred it slowly, savoring the silence, the kind of silence that had once felt like loneliness but now felt like peace. No fireworks yet outside, just the low rumble of the heater kicking on and the gentle tap of wind against the old windows. Thoughtful pause. I imagined David across town, standing near some rooftop bar, with a heated lamp glowing above him, drink in one hand, his other arm around Margaret's shoulders. Champagne flutes clinking elegantly, toasts to health, to goals, to new beginnings. I imagined him laughing, carefree. I wasn't bitter anymore. Not really. There's something clarifying about being alone when no one thinks you should be present. You start to see the architecture of your own life more clearly, all the rooms you've been locked out of, and all the doors you never knew you could open yourself. I scrolled through news headlines on my tablet, not really expecting anything noteworthy. Then it appeared. Breaking. PulseScan AI confirms over $1 billion acquisition of predictive imaging tool. The subtitle was more direct, created by retired radiologist Eleanor Ventnor. I stared at those words for a long moment, feeling something shift in my chest. Then I calmly put the tablet down, finished my soup, and blew out the candle. At 12:01 in the morning, exactly 1 minute into the new year, the phone buzzed violently against the counter. David. I let it ring once, twice. Then I picked up. Mother. His voice was immediately elevated, almost frantic. Did you sell something? People are tagging me everywhere. Clients, old colleagues, everyone I know. What in God's name is going on? Voice calm, almost eerily so. I stood by the window, watching a neighbor's sparkler flicker in the snowy distance. Remember those skin doodles you called a phase? I said quietly, the ones you made fun of at Thanksgiving. He didn't answer right away. They were worth something, I continued. Apparently quite a lot. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, softly, almost childlike, why didn't you tell me? I leaned my forehead against the cold glass of the window. Because you wouldn't have asked if it hadn't made headlines, David. That's why. I could hear his breath catch, hear him struggling for words. I waited for anger, for accusations, for the defensive justifications I knew so well. Instead, he said, we need to talk. As a family. Slight laugh. I'm available tomorrow. I told him, already knowing the conversation wouldn't be about me. It would be about control, about damage management, about protecting their image. At 12:05 in the morning, my phone vibrated again with a sound I hadn't heard in months. The family group chat, dormant for so long I'd nearly forgotten it existed, suddenly exploding with activity. Emergency family call at 9 a.m. tomorrow. David had sent it. No greeting, no context. Seconds later, Mom, please don't say anything to the media yet. Then Sophie, we need to control the narrative. Don't ruin this for all of us. Can you believe this? They ignored her for months, and now suddenly it's we. What would you do in this situation? I read those messages twice, my jaw tightening with each word. Control the narrative. As if my entire life had been a draft they'd been editing all along. As if my work, my silence, my patience had only been placeholders until they decided how the story should end and who should get credit. Deep breath. I didn't respond to the group chat. Instead, I set the phone face down and opened my email. It refreshed endlessly, requests stacking on top of one another like falling dominoes. Journalists, medical boards, conference organizers. Someone from a European diagnostics firm asking for a discreet conversation. Another from a university wanting to name a fellowship after me. I skimmed without answering any of them. The attention felt distant, almost theoretical, like weather reports from places I had no intention of visiting. Then one subject line stopped me cold. Vermont Rural Medical Alliance. Keynote invitation. I opened it slowly, my heart beating faster. They wrote about clinics closing, about technicians working double shifts without proper equipment, about hospitals 2 hours from the nearest specialist. They wrote about how PulseScan AI could mean earlier detection, fewer emergency transports, more precious time for families. They didn't ask about my family. They didn't mention the money. They asked if I would speak about building something meaningful without being seen, about doing important work in the shadows. Voice breaking with emotion. I replied with a single word, yes. The group chat buzzed again, immediately. David typing, deleting, typing again. I didn't look. I stood from the table and rinsed my mug carefully, the sound of running water grounding me in the present moment. For the first time that night, I felt absolutely certain of something. Whatever they planned to say in the morning, whatever polished version of me they wanted to present to the world, it would move forward without my permission. And that was exactly how I intended to keep it. The morning confrontation was coming, and I was ready, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to say to my own children. Part 4 will break your heart. We met at the little cafe on Maple Street, the one with the chalkboard, menu, and ridiculously overpriced fruit bowls. I chose it deliberately because it was neutral territory. No shared history there. No birthdays celebrated. No holidays remembered. No memories they could weaponize to soften me up. Sophie arrived first, 5 minutes early, as always. She hugged me stiffly, her body barely making contact with mine, then sat across from me with her designer coat still buttoned all the way up, her lips pressed into a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Tense pause. "You embarrassed us, Mother," she said, skipping any pretense of pleasantries. "Completely humiliated us." I stirred my coffee gently, the spoon making soft, clinking sounds against the ceramic. "I didn't say a word. The article didn't even have your photograph, but people knew," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "It was everywhere on LinkedIn, on Twitter, everywhere. Do you have any idea how it looks when your own mother suddenly becomes worth hundreds of millions, and her children are completely blindsided?" Voice shaking with controlled anger. David walked in mid-sentence, his eyes scanning the cafe like we were being watched by paparazzi. He probably wished we were. "Mother," he said, sliding into the seat beside Sophie with practiced precision. "You could have told us. You should have told us. We could have helped you manage this entire situation properly." "Manage what exactly?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. "My own work." He blinked, rapidly, caught off guard. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her facade cracking just slightly. I watched them both recalibrate, searching for a new angle of attack. "Look," David said, his voice softening into what he probably thought was a compassionate tone. "This could actually be wonderful for all of us. A real family venture. We can discuss how to structure everything so everyone benefits properly." "There's still time to bring us in officially," Sophie added quickly, leaning forward. "Public image consulting, media messaging, legacy planning. We can help position this correctly." Long pause. I set down my spoon carefully, the sound impossibly loud in the moment. The cafe buzzed with life behind them, forks clinking against plates, soft jazz playing from hidden speakers, the hiss of the espresso machine. But all I could hear was the deafening silence that stretched between their carefully chosen words. I could see it so clearly now. It wasn't surprise in their eyes. It was calculation. Strategy. They were already dividing up something that had never belonged to them. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. It already was a family venture. I said quietly, but with steel in my voice. "You just never showed up for it. Not once." Voice breaking. I didn't wait for their reactions, didn't give them a chance to argue or explain or justify. I picked up my coat with trembling hands, tucked my scarf into my sleeve, and walked past the line of people waiting for tables, feeling their curious eyes on me. Outside, the January air bit at my face, sharp and brutally clean. It felt like breathing for the first time in years. By the time I reached the street corner, my phone was vibrating again. A new number, a new offer. But it was the next email that truly made me stop walking and lean against a cold brick wall. Would you have walked out like that? Or would you have tried to fix things with your family? Be honest in the comments. I almost canceled the television interview. The producer had called twice, then left a voicemail that sounded more hopeful than professional, more personal than it should have been. "Local angle," she'd said enthusiastically. Human interest story. People love these kinds of narratives. I stared at that voicemail for hours while my coffee went cold, telling myself I didn't owe anyone an explanation, didn't need to justify my existence or my choices to strangers. But in the end, I showed up anyway. The news anchor was younger than David, younger than Sophie too, probably in his late 20s. He wore a suit that hadn't quite learned how to sit properly on his shoulders, and when he smiled, it was earnest in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable, like he actually cared. He thanked me profusely for coming, as if I'd done him some enormous favor instead of agreeing to a standard interview. We sat under impossibly bright lights that made my eyes water. The questions started predictably enough. Background information, the technology details, what it felt like to have years of quiet work suddenly thrust into the spotlight. I answered carefully, keeping my voice steady and professional, giving away nothing personal. Then he leaned forward slightly and asked, "Ms. Ventnor, did your family support your journey throughout this process?" Long, heavy pause. I felt the silence before I created it. Not long enough to be obviously dramatic, just long enough to be unmistakably honest. They supported my silence. I said, finally, each word deliberate. When I started speaking in code instead of conversations, started building instead of simply existing, they left the room. Every single time. Voice thick with emotion, nearly breaking. The anchor blinked, clearly not expecting that level of raw honesty. He nodded slowly, professionally, and moved on to safer questions. But I knew in my bones that moment had already escaped the controlled environment of that studio. By the time I got home, 40 minutes later, my phone was buzzing nonstop, vibrating its way across the kitchen counter like it was alive. I didn't check it. I set it face down with a decisive motion and walked away. Later that evening, Sarah texted me, "It's everywhere, Eleanor. Absolutely everywhere." David's law firm, apparently, had been fielding calls since the clip aired during the evening news. Clients asking pointed questions, colleagues forwarding links with raised eyebrows and uncomfortable silences. Sophie, I heard through a mutual acquaintance, had quietly deleted every social media account she'd ever carefully curated, every perfectly filtered photo suddenly a liability. Slight, bitter laugh. I didn't look any of it up. I didn't search for clips or read comments or check trending topics. Instead, I sorted through my mail like it was any other evening. Bills, grocery store flyers, and an envelope from Vermont Children's Oncology, the same organization that sent me a letter every quarter with a handwritten note and a list of urgent needs they could never quite fill. I sat at my kitchen table, reread their letters slowly, and opened my laptop with steady hands. I doubled my quarterly donation without a second thought. It felt right, grounding, like returning something valuable to the world instead of just taking from it. When I closed the computer, the house was quiet again. And for the first time in weeks, that quiet didn't feel like absence or loneliness. It felt like space, the kind of sacred space that makes room for decisions you don't have to rush into, for choices that are entirely your own. Soft exhale. David texted early the next morning. "Can we come by this weekend? We need to talk properly." I read it once, then again, noticing how carefully the sentence avoided anything resembling an actual apology. "No, I'm sorry." "No, are you okay?" "No, we were wrong." Just logistics, as if physical proximity could reset everything that had shattered between us. I typed back simply, "I'm traveling." I wasn't, but I could be. The world felt suddenly bigger than it ever had before. That afternoon, I put the kettle on and let it whistle longer than necessary, the sound filling my small house with something that felt almost like music. I chose my favorite mug, the one with the hairline crack near the handle that nobody else would use, and carried it outside into my small backyard. The ground was still frozen, edged with frost that glittered in the weak winter sunlight, stubbornly refusing to surrender to the day's warmth. I walked the perimeter slowly, both hands wrapped around the heat of the mug, watching my breath rise and disappear into the cold air, like tiny ghosts. Reflective pause. For years, decades, really, I'd measured my days by interruptions. Phone calls requesting favors. Requests for my time that weren't really requests. Small demands carefully dressed up as concern or family obligation. Now, there was nothing pressing against the edges of my time. No one knocking. No one waiting with expectations I could never quite meet. No one disappointed in who I was. I realized with a start that I hadn't checked my phone in over 4 hours. That might have been a record. Inside, I sat at my desk and opened a folder on my computer that I'd created weeks earlier, but hadn't yet had the courage to fully explore. Grant proposals from small-town clinics. Places with names that rarely appeared in any headlines, places people from the city forgot existed. One clinic desperately needed imaging equipment upgrades to avoid sending critical patients 2 counties away on dangerous winter roads. Another wanted training funds for technicians who'd never been formally certified but showed up every single day anyway, learning as they went, caring deeply despite the system's failures. Voice getting emotional. I read each proposal carefully, not skimming, not multitasking with email or news. Just reading. Really reading. These people didn't know my personal story. They didn't know my children's names or what had happened at that cafe or on New Year's Eve. They weren't remotely interested in optics or positioning or who stood beside me in photographs. They believed in outcomes, in actual care, in showing up when it mattered most, even when nobody was watching or applauding. By late afternoon, the light had shifted through my windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I closed the folder, not finished, but satisfied for now. My phone remained untouched on the kitchen counter. No follow-up from David. No doorbell rings. No unexpected visitors. I thought about how often I'd waited in the past, by the window, by the phone, by the front door, hoping desperately that someone would remember to include me, to think of me, to want me there. Stronger now. This time, I didn't wait for anything or anyone. I poured another cup of tea and sat back down, already aware that the next call I answered wouldn't be about reconciliation or apologies. It would be about something far more lasting. Sometimes the best gift is the space to become who you were always meant to be. Do you agree? It was late afternoon when the phone finally rang with an actual call, not a text or email. I almost didn't answer, my hand hovering over the screen. But then I saw the name, Claire, Sophie's daughter, 12 years old now, maybe 13. We hadn't spoken directly in months, maybe longer. Still, something made me pick up. "Hi, Grandma." Her voice was bright, but carried a thread of nervousness underneath. "Is now an okay time?" Voice softening. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, leaning back in my chair, feeling my entire body relax for the first time all day. "What's on your mind?" "I have a school project," she said quickly, words tumbling over each other. "We're supposed to pick someone we actually know to write about." "What's the topic?" "People who change things quietly, without making a big noise about it." I didn't speak for a moment, my throat tightening unexpectedly. Claire continued into my silence. "I asked Mom if I could call you. She said it was up to me." I could perfectly imagine Sophie's expression when she said that, lips thin, eyes distant, giving permission while simultaneously disapproving. I let it pass like water off stone. "Well," I said gently, "that's a beautiful topic, Claire. Really beautiful. So, can I write about you?" Long emotional pause. I looked out my window. The sky had turned soft gray, fading into pale pink at the edges like a watercolor painting. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once, then stopped abruptly. The world felt held in suspended pause, waiting. "Of course you can write about me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What would you like to know?" Claire hesitated, and I could hear her taking a breath, gathering courage. "I guess why you did it. The work, the company, everything. Why did you do it all alone?" Voice thick with emotion. I took a deep breath that settled somewhere in my chest before reaching my voice. "Tell them I didn't do it to be known or famous," I said slowly, choosing each word with care. "I did it so that people like you, people in small towns, people without resources, might have better tools, better chances, better outcomes. That's all. That was always all it was about." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, almost shyly, "I already wrote the title. Actually, want to hear it?" "Absolutely. It's called The Billionaire in the Backyard." Suddenly laughing, real and full, I laughed out loud. A genuine, full-bodied laugh I hadn't let escape in months. The kind of laugh that shakes your whole body and brings tears to your eyes for entirely different reasons. "I love that," I said, still chuckling. "I absolutely love it. But make sure you tell them I still pull weeds and burn the toast regularly. Keep it honest." She giggled, the sound like bells. "I will, Grandma. I promise." We talked a little longer about her classes, her science fair project, her favorite teacher, who made chemistry actually interesting. Easy conversation. Real conversation. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, like your dreams didn't matter to the people who were supposed to love you most. And if you've dealt with something similar, please share your story. You're not alone in this. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life, because everyone deserves to be seen. Soft, contented voice. No one else called that evening. No one needed to. When we finally hung up, I stayed by the window for a long time, watching the light gradually shift across the bare trees, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. And then, in that perfect quiet, I opened my old leather notebook, the one I'd carried through decades of work and silence, and began writing something new. Not for them, not for approval or validation or permission, just for me. Final pause, voice strong and certain. The story wasn't over. It was finally, truly beginning.